I control the water that everyone else forgets exists. There is a particular kind of stillness that gathers over a canal in the hour before sunrise, and it is not quite like the stillness of a lake, or a river, or any other water. A river is always going somewhere, even in the dark, always murmuring about its business. A lake belongs to the wind. But a canal at 5 o'clock on a summer morning is water that has been told, politely and firmly, to wait, and it does. It lies between its stone edges like a length of dark ribbon laid out on a tailor's table, so still that the first pale light does not so much reflect off it as settle into it, and the only movement anywhere is the slow drift of mist coming off the surface, unraveling in threads over the towpath. Into this stillness, at around 5:15, comes the sound of a door latch. It is a small sound, but in that silence it carries the whole length of the lock flight. The lock-keeper is up. The lock-keeper's cottage stands, as such cottages nearly always stand, close enough to the lock that its windows keep watch over the gates, with a low garden wall, a line of hollyhocks in summer, and a water butt at the corner that has been catching the same roof's rain for 100 years and more. The cottage came with the job, and in a sense the cottage is the job. Whoever lives here is never entirely off duty, in the way that a lighthouse keeper is never entirely off duty, or the keeper of a level crossing. The canal is always there, a few steps from the kitchen door, holding its water and its patience, and the person in the cottage is answerable for a stretch of it, for its levels, its gates, its paddles, its weeds, its moods, and for every boat that comes through from the first of the morning to the last of the light. Our keeper, and we shall spend this whole unhurried day in her company, though she would be quietly baffled by the attention, begins as keepers have always begun, with the level. Before the kettle, before anything, she steps out into the damp air in her boots and walks the few yards to the lock, and looks at the water. This is not an idle look. The canal is an artificial thing from end to end, a made river with no natural supply of its own, and every drop it holds has been begged, borrowed or pumped. Overnight, water finds its own opinions. It seeps through old gates that have been weeping gently since the reign of some distant king. It slips past paddles that no longer quite seat true. A whole pound, which is the name for the stretch of level water between one lock and the next, can drop an inch or two in a night through nothing more dramatic than 1,000 small agreements between water and worn timber. So she looks first at the marks she knows, the wet line on the lock wall, the particular course of bricks that the water should be touching, the depth of the mooring stones. This morning the level is down perhaps a finger's width, which is nothing, which is entirely ordinary, and there is a small satisfaction in finding an ordinary thing exactly as ordinary as it should be. She checks the gates next. A lock, when you strip away the romance of it, is a very large wooden box with a door at each end, and the doors are the heart of everything. Each gate is a great slab of oak or elm, black with age and tar, heavier than a farm cart, hung on an iron pin at the heel and closed against a sill of stone at the bottom. They meet at an angle, pointing towards the higher water, so that the very pressure of the canal itself holds them shut, which is the sort of quiet, self-evident cleverness that canal engineering is full of, the cleverness of people who had no engines and so made gravity and water do the work instead. She leans on the balance beam of the top gate, that long white-tipped arm of timber that reaches back over the grass, placed there to give a human being just enough leverage to move a door that outweighs her many times over, and feels it firm against its sill. All is as it was. All is as it should be. And then, only then, the kettle. There is a rhythm to a lock-keeper's morning tea that has nothing to do with hurry. From the kitchen window she can see a good half-mile down the cut, past the willow that leans at the far bend, and nothing is moving on the water except a pair of moorhens making their small fussy patrols along the reeds. The first boat will not be along for an hour yet. The tea is drunk at the door, in the company of the mist, and if there is a finer companion for a cup of tea than Canal mist on a June morning, it has not yet been discovered. It is worth pausing, while she drinks it, to consider where all this came from, because a loch is one of those objects so settled into the landscape that it seems to have grown there, and it did not. There was a time, and it is not so very long ago as these things go, when this valley had no canal in it at all, only a track and a slow river some miles off, and everything heavy that needed moving, coal, stone, lime, timber, grain, moved at the pace of a horse's legs on bad roads, a few tons at a time, at a cost that made heavy things precious. The canal age changed that with almost indecent simplicity. A horse that could drag a ton or two on a road could draw 30 tons or more on water, walking gently along a towpath, because water is generous and asks almost nothing of a load once it is floating. The difficulty was never the flatness, water lies flat by nature, the difficulty was the hills. Water will not flow uphill, and no amount of 18th century ingenuity could persuade it to. What the engineers did instead was to cut the canal into steps, long flat treads of still water, and to join each step to the next with a lock, a chamber in which a boat, and the water beneath it, could be raised or lowered from one level to another, a few feet at a time, using nothing but the canal's own supply and a pair of well-hung doors. A flight of locks is a staircase for boats, and it is climbed not with effort but with patience. The first boat of the day announces itself long before it arrives. Sound travels down a canal the way it travels down a corridor, and she hears the steady, unhurried beat of an engine, a gentle, domestic sort of thudding, like a heartbeat with a slight cold, a good few minutes before the bow comes round the willow bend. It is a narrow boat, of course, 70 feet of painted steel moving at walking pace, with a tiller at the stern and a chimney breathing a thin line of smoke, and it approaches the loch with the deference all boats learn, slowly, slowly. Everything on a canal happens slowly, and nearly all of its rare accidents are the fault of someone who forgot that. The loch this morning is full, its water level with the upper pound, because that is how the last boat of yesterday evening left it. But this boat is coming up from below, and so the chamber must first be emptied to meet it. And here begins the small liturgy that will repeat, with variations, 20 or 30 times before the light goes this evening, a sequence of actions so orderly, so unchanging, so entirely resistant to being rushed, that describing it slowly is not a stylistic choice but simple accuracy. She walks to the bottom gates. At each gate there are paddles, sliding shutters of wood or iron, down below the waterline, that cover openings in the gate or in culverts through the masonry beside it. Each paddle is raised by its own winding gear, a toothed rack, a pinion, a spindle squared off to take the windlass, which is the L-shaped iron crank that every boater and every keeper carries the way other trades carry a hammer. She sets her windlass on the spindle, checks the safety catch, and begins to wind. The paddle comes up tooth by tooth, click by click over its ratchet, and beneath her feet, she can feel it through the stone, the water begins to move. It does not gush. A well-designed loch does not gush, it breathes. The chamber's water slides away through the culverts into the pound below, and the surface inside the loch begins to descend, calmly, an inch at a time, with a low steady rush somewhere under the ground like a bath emptying in a distant part of a large house. It takes some minutes for a loch to empty, and they are good minutes, minutes with nothing wrong in them. The keeper leans on the beam and watches the water go down, and the wet walls of the chamber rise up out of it, green-black with weed at the waterline, then darker and older below, brick by brick, until the lock stands revealed as the deep stone room it is, floored with quiet water, its walls striped with a century of waterlines. Swallows, who nest under the footbridge, cut back and forth over the emptying chamber after insects. The boat waits below the bottom gates, its engine ticking over, its steerer leaning on the tiller with the particular contentment of a person whose entire morning consists of this. When the levels match, and the moment they match is visible, the water at the gate going suddenly slack and undecided, the bottom gates can be opened. She closes the paddles first, always, winding them gently down. Paddles left open are the beginning of half the mischief a lock can devise. Then she puts her back against the balance beam, braces her boots on the worn cobbles. There are 2 shallow grooves in those cobbles, polished by generations of exactly this bracing, and walks the gate open. It goes with a long, low groan of iron pin and wet oak, a sound the canal has been making for 200 years, and the gate folds back into its recess in the wall and lies still. The boat comes in. There is a courtesy to this part, a raised hand from the steerer, a word or 2 about the morning, no more, because the canal's conversations are rationed by the pace of the work, a sentence at the gate, another at the paddles, the rest saved for some other year. The boat slides into the chamber, dead slow, and stops with its bow a respectful distance from the top gates, and the steerer loops a line around a bollard, not to hold the boat still but to steady it against the stir of the filling. She closes the bottom gates behind it, one and then the other, crossing the lock on the narrow walkway along the gate tops with the unthinking balance of long practice. And then she walks to the top end and begins the second half of the liturgy, the filling. The top paddles are opened, gently at first, always gently, because the water enters at the boat's bow and a rush of it too soon will snub the boat about and set it surging in the chamber like a spoon in a stirred cup. Half a paddle first. The water comes in below the surface, a deep green upwelling that blooms in the chamber like weather, and the boat begins, almost imperceptibly, to rise. This is the part that no one, in 2 centuries, has managed to make boring, though the canal has certainly tried. 100 tons of water are moving, and there is almost nothing to see, only the wet walls slowly submerging again, the waterline climbing back up the bricks it left 20 minutes ago, the boat's gunwale rising past the courses of masonry, the steerer's head coming gradually level with the towpath, then above it. The whole operation runs on nothing but the difference in height between one pound and the next, no pump, no engine, no power but the patient weight of water that was lifted here, ultimately, by rain falling on hills some miles away and gathered down feeders and reservoirs built by men in waistcoats who never saw an electric light. When the chamber is full, the levels agree, the top gates swing, and the boat goes on its way up the summit pound, sitting 7 or 8 feet higher in the world than it was a quarter of an hour ago, having burned nothing to get there but time. And the lock stands full again, and the morning goes on. By the middle of the day the rhythm is established, boats coming through at the rate the canal decides, sometimes 2 waiting, sometimes an hour of nothing, and the keeper's attention turns, in the gaps, to the endless gentle maintenance that is the true bulk of the work. It would be possible to believe, watching from the footbridge, that a lock-keeper's job is opening gates, but the gates are almost a hobby, the real work is water and weed and grease. There is the greasing of the paddle gear, each rack and pinion getting its dab of thick brown grease from a tin that lives in the workshop and has, apparently, always lived there. There is the raking of the weed. Canal weed grows in summer with an enthusiasm that borders on rudeness, and a mat of it around a bottom gate will stop the gate seating true, which will weep the pound away overnight, so she works along the approaches with a long-handled rake, drawing up dripping green swathes of it and leaving them in modest compost heaps along the hedge line, where the moorhens inspect them for interest. There is the sweeping of the lockside, the coiling of lines, the touch of paint, white on the beam tips, black on the ironwork, applied a little at a time, forever, in the way that great bridges are painted, never finished, never neglected. And there is the walking of the pound. In the early afternoon, in the slack hour, she takes the towpath along her stretch, 1.5 miles of it, at a pace that would embarrass no heron. This is inspection, though it looks like a stroll. She is reading the water's edge as she goes, the level against the stones at the far bridge, the culvert under the old road, listening for the correct trickle, the leak in the offside bank by the poplar, a known leak, an old acquaintance, a slow seep into the field that has been kept an eye on by 4 successive keepers and is doing nothing it hasn't done for decades. The heron who owns the reach lifts off ahead of her, aggrieved, glides 60 yards, and resumes its statue. Dragonflies stitch along the margins. A boat passes and its wash laps the bank twice and is gone, and the canal closes over the event completely, restoring its ribbon stillness within a minute, as if motion were a small error it knew how to correct. It is on this walk, most days, that the arithmetic of water occupies her. A lockkeeper thinks about water the way a shopkeeper thinks about stock. Every boat that goes down through the lock takes a lockful of water down with it, tens of thousands of gallons, spent from the upper pound and paid to the lower, and every boat that comes up spends the same again. The water must all be replaced from up the line, from the reservoirs in the hills, from the feeder streams, from the back pumps at the deep locks that return water uphill in dry months, electric now, though the pump house still has the bricked outline of the old boiler door. In a wet spring nobody thinks about it, the canal brims and the weirs sing. But in a long dry August the pounds drop day by day, and keepers along the whole flight begin to husband their locks like careful housewives, sending boats through in pairs to share a lockful, holding a chamber full overnight, watching the sky over the hills with a professional interest in rain. The whole 70-mile system is one connected body of water, and a keeper feels her mile of it the way one feels a draft in a large old house, evidence of doors and weathers a long way off. It is also on this walk that she passes the milestone, a squat wedge of gritstone half sunk in the hedge bank, its carved figures softened by weather to a rumor, and the milestone is as good a place as any to remember the diggers. The canal was made by hand. It is an astonishing thing to hold in the mind on a drowsy afternoon. Every yard of this channel, 70 miles of it, was dug with picks and shovels and barrows by gangs of itinerant laborers, navigators, they were called, navvies for short, because they built the navigations, who came into the valley in their hundreds, lodged in barns and cut turf shelters, ate prodigiously, were paid by the yard, and moved on. They puddled the canal bed to make it hold water, and puddling is a process so wonderfully primitive that it deserves description. Clay, dug locally, was mixed with water and a little sand and then trodden, literally trodden, by boots and sometimes by driven cattle, layer upon layer into a dense, gleaming, waterproof lining, 3 feet thick under the bed of the canal. That trodden clay is still down there, under the boats, under the moorhens, doing its silent work 2 centuries on. There is no part of the modern world quite so calmly confident as a piece of 18th century puddled clay that has decided to remain waterproof forever. The horse era left its own handwriting on her mile. The towpath itself is the plainest sentence of it, a road built for 1 horse walking, still exactly 1 horse wide. Under the road bridge, where the path narrows, the corners of the stonework are worn into deep, smooth flutes by the tow-lines of 10,000 passing horses, each rope sawing its soft groove a hair's breadth at a time, the way water carves limestone, and those grooves are now protected features, polished by history and, it must be said, by the idle thumbs of everyone who stops to look at them. By the stable block at the top lock, a workshop now, There are still iron rings in the wall, and a worn brick apron where horses stood to be fed, and if you put your hand flat on that brick on a warm evening it is easy to persuade yourself the warmth is more than the day's sun. It is only the day's sun. But the persuasion is pleasant and harmless, and the keeper permits herself a version of it most summers. The afternoon brings its modest events, each arriving at Canal pace and departing the same way. A hire boat comes through crewed by a family for whom every part of the process is new, and she talks them through the paddles with the mild, practiced patience of someone who has explained the same beautiful obvious thing 1,000 times and has decided to go on enjoying it, gently on the windlass, never leave it on the spindle, let the water do the work it wants to. A fisherman sets up below the bottom gates, where the emptying lock stirs the water and, he maintains, stirs the fish he catches, over 3 hours, one modest perch and a great deal of quiet, which is, he would agree, the correct ratio. The post is delivered to the cottage by a postwoman who props her bicycle against the garden wall in the exact spot the previous postman propped his, the wall being slightly polished there. Tea happens twice. The level is looked at more times than can usefully be counted, because looking at the level is not really a task, it is a posture of mind, the keeper's equivalent of a shepherd counting without knowing she is counting. Winter, it should be said, is another country here, and the keeper would not want it left out of any honest account of the year. In a hard January the canal does the one thing a canal does dramatically, it stops. Still water freezes readily, and there are mornings when the whole pound has set overnight into a lid of gray-green ice, an inch, 2 inches, thick enough to hold the weight of a determined dog and the prints of every moorhen in the parish. In the working days they broke it, there were ice boats, heavy-built and iron-sheathed, rocked side to side by a dozen men clinging to a rail while horses hauled from the bank, splitting a channel so the coal could get through, because the coal always had to get through. Now the boats mostly wait, and the keeper's winter work is quieter, keeping a channel open at the gates so the ice cannot lever them, draining the vulnerable pipework, salting the lockside stones, and feeding an opportunistic robin that has learned the exact hour of her morning round. And winter is when the lock has its holiday, or rather its surgery. Every few years, in the dead season, the stoppage comes, a planned closure, published months ahead in the way of all canal news, when the engineers arrive and the lock is emptied not just of water but of purpose. Stop planks, great squared timbers that live all year in a rack by the footbridge, numbered like hymn boards, are lowered one by one into their grooves at each end of the chamber until the lock is sealed off from the canal entirely, and then the water between is pumped down and away, and there, for a fortnight, is the sight that never stops being strange, the lock stark empty, a deep stone room open to the sky, its floor of black mud and lost windlasses and the occasional astonished eel, its gates hanging exposed like the doors of some drained cathedral. Any fish caught in the chamber are netted and carried, indignant, around to the pound below, fish rescue being one of those jobs that sounds invented and is entirely real. The masons point the walls. The carpenters and fitters see to the gates, or, once in a generation, replace them whole, the new oak arriving on a lorry looking pale and startled and needing a good 10 years to blacken into dignity. Then the planks come out, the water is let back in with a ceremony no one calls a ceremony, and the lock takes up its work again as if nothing had happened, which, by its own long measure of things, is very nearly true. Towards evening the light goes long in gold, and the canal performs its one daily extravagance. It becomes, for half an hour, a strip of pure sky laid into the fields, the hedges doubled darkly in it, the lock gates standing up out of their own reflections like black paper cutouts. The last boat of the day comes up through the lock at about 8, a single-hander who works the paddles herself with her own windlass while the keeper does the gates, the two of them moving through the liturgy in an easy silence broken only by the click of the ratchets and the deep breathing of the culverts. The boat rises, the gates swing, a hand is raised, the engine's heartbeat fades up the pound and is absorbed, at last, into the general quiet. Then comes the closing of the day, which is done in the same order it has always been done. The lock is left full and settled, gates snug against their sills, every paddle wound down to its seat and the catch is on. She walks the chamber's rim once, checking each paddle by feel in the failing light, because a paddle left a few clicks up is the difference between a full pound at dawn and an apologetic telephone call to the keeper below. The windlass goes back on its hook in the porch. The workshop is shut. The moorhens have folded themselves into the reeds, a fish rises once, softly, up by the willow, and the ring it makes travels the whole width of the canal and arrives at the far bank as barely a suggestion. She stands for a minute at the garden wall, as keepers do, looking at the water she is answerable for. The level is right. The gates are holding. Somewhere under the ground the culverts are weeping their slow, permitted ounce or two back down the hill, and the canal lies along its valley in the dusk, 70 miles of borrowed rain standing perfectly still in the dark, waiting, patiently, as it has waited every night for 200 years, for morning, and the latch, and the first boat round the willow bend. And the light in the cottage window goes out, and the canal keeps its level all night long, give or take a finger's width, which is nothing, which is entirely ordinary, and there is a deep and excellent sleep to be had in the company of a thing so thoroughly, so faithfully, so contentedly ordinary as that.